Enjoy.
While Li Rang was in the middle of his meal, frustration and embarrassment flooded his expression. His brow furrowed as he reflected on the situation, his annoyance barely concealed. He couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. He had been sent to the Mudang sect as a gesture of goodwill, a social experience, as Master Jiangju had described it. But here was his companion, Eunho, acting in a way that defied the teachings of respect and restraint instilled in every martial artist. Li Rang's frustration grew with every passing moment, his emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. He had hoped for an uneventful meal, but it was clear that was not going to happen. The other disciples, particularly those of the Mudang sect, were watching. Their silent disapproval was evident, only intensifying Li Rang's sense of shame. How could he face them after this? As he tried to regain his composure, Eunho, completely disregarding Li Rang's attempts to manage the situation, flung his chopstick in a fit of irritation. It flew across the room and embedded itself in the wooden table right in front of Li Rang, its sharp end quivering from the force of Eunho's throw. The act was deliberate, as if to punctuate Eunho's dissatisfaction, but Li Rang was left bewildered. Scrambling for words that would both calm his senior brother and soothe the tension in the room. "See, senior brother," Li Rang began, his voice trembling as he tried to reason with Eunho. But before he could offer any meaningful placation, Eunho's eyes flared with irritation. His voice, heavy with displeasure, echoed through the room. It wasn't Li Rang's rebuke that had triggered him. Rather, it was the food. The lack of meat on the table, a fundamental part of what Eunho believed made a meal complete, had pushed him over the edge. His mutterings about the inadequacy of the meal filled the air as he angrily berated the vegetarian fare that had been placed before them. The absence of even a single fish was an unforgivable offense in his eyes. How could the Mudang sect expect guests, martial artists no less, to thrive on a meal devoid of any meat? This wasn't just an issue of taste. Eunho seemed to imply it was a matter of respect. Li Rang, caught between his loyalty to his senior and his need to preserve the fragile relationship with the Mudang sect, tried to offer an explanation. The Mudang clan, he reminded Eunho, adhered strictly to a vegetarian diet as part of their teachings and way of life. They had no intention of offending anyone. It was simply their tradition. But even this explanation only incited further scorn from Eunho. "Wicked bastards!" Eunho spat out, unable to contain his disdain. The absurdity of such an extreme diet was beyond his comprehension. Not even goats, he fumed, would be so strict as to abstain from meat entirely. As night descended over the Mudang sect, Eunho found himself restless in his quarters. Lying back on the hard wooden bed, a deep sigh escaped him, the weight of frustration pressing down on his chest. The endless offerings of vegetarian food throughout the day had worn him down. It wasn't just the meals that bothered him, it was the way they seemed to gnaw at his very being. The Taoists of the sect, devout in their practices, served only meatless dishes, and the absence of rich, hearty flavors was starting to get under Eunho's skin. Annoyance simmered within him, keeping sleep at bay. He sat up on the bed, reflecting bitterly on the irony of his situation. As a human now, he was still as sensitive to such meals as he had been during his days as a yokai, the supernatural spirit he once was. The shift to a human body hadn't rid him of his distaste for this kind of food, and tonight it seemed worse than ever. Suddenly, a sharp realization jolted him from his thoughts. He couldn't feel the presence of Li Rang. His companion, who had been staying in the neighboring room, was nowhere to be found. Confusion flickered across Eunho's face as he quickly rose from the bed, his mind racing. Without a word of departure and without Eunho even noticing, Li Rang had slipped away. Eunho stepped into Li Rang's quarters, but they were eerily empty. No sign of him, no explanation. Where could that guy have gone? Eunho's thoughts raced, a mix of concern and irritation flooding his mind. Li Rang walked side by side with Jin Yangjin, his tone light but filled with a hint of regret. He marveled at the revelation of Jin Yangjin's high standing, feeling that if he had known sooner, he would have made more of an effort to visit earlier. Their strides were leisurely, the air between them filled with familiarity, but beneath the surface there was the subtle weight of unspoken matters. Jin Youngjin, though polite, subtly questioned Li Ryang's absence, wondering why he hadn't visited sooner if nothing serious had held him back. Li Ryang offered a simple explanation, his words carrying the wariness of a wandering monk. This place wasn't an inn, after all, not somewhere he could come and go as he pleased. It required a certain formality, a purpose for entering, something that didn't align with his transient lifestyle. Jin Youngjin, sensing the need to shift the conversation, steered their talk toward more personal matters. He inquired about Li Ryang's master, a figure who clearly weighed heavily on his old friend's mind. With a sigh, Li Ryang confessed that his master hadn't changed. His demeanor remained as difficult as ever, a constant source of frustration for his disciple. Jin Youngjin, sympathetic to his plight, offered words of comfort, reminding him that adjusting to such a personality was bound to be an exhausting task. Li Ryang agreed wholeheartedly, the mere thought of his master draining his energy. The two shared a knowing look, Jin Youngjin reflecting on his own past frustrations. He recalled the challenges of trying to communicate with Li Ryang's master, the conversations that seemed to go in circles, leaving him exasperated. Li Ryang chuckled at this shared experience, admiring Jin Youngjin's endurance. Despite the difficulties, his friend had managed to navigate those interactions for quite some time, a feat that wasn't easily accomplished. Eunho carefully scanned his surroundings, his senses sharp and alert. He was certain he had felt the presence of someone, an unmistakable aura that he couldn't ignore. His eyes darted back and forth as he tried to pinpoint the location. Where could Li Ryang be? The air around him seemed heavy with an elusive energy, heightening his awareness. As his gaze swept across the area, something unexpected caught his eye. A statue, standing still and silent, drew his attention. Intrigued, Eunho approached it, curiosity sparking within him. The closer he got, the more familiar the figure appeared. Recognition flickered in his mind and soon realization dawned on him. The face carved into the stone wasn't just any face, it was someone he knew well. The unmistakable likeness of Yo Dongbin stared back at him, a figure from his past, immortalized in stone. Yo Dongbin's voice echoed with fury, his words sharp and filled with indignation. He glared at Eunho, his anger fueled by years of unresolved conflict. For decades he had waited for a response to his summons, yet the fox spirit had avoided him at every turn. The frustration boiled over, and Yo Dongbin's accusation rang through the air, filled with righteous indignation. Eunho, however, met this outburst with a mocking indifference. His tone carried a hint of amusement, as if Yo Dongbin's anger was little more than a trivial annoyance. To him, the divine fox was nothing more than an insignificant figure, beneath his attention. He taunted Yo Dongbin, claiming that he had been too busy accumulating merit, dismissing the confrontation with an air of superiority. The insult only deepened Yo Dongbin's rage. In a fit of anger, he drew his sword, the blade gleaming as he prepared to strike. His movements were swift and precise, the force behind the attack immense, aimed directly at Eunho. It was an assault that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Eunho remained unfazed. As Yo Dongbin's sword sliced through the air, Eunho raised his hand, catching the blade with his bare palm. The impact reverberated, but the sword went no further. With a calm yet irritated voice, Eunho rebuked his attacker, asserting that if Yo Dongbin had something to say, he should speak with words rather than resort to violence. The effortless way Eunho stopped the attack demonstrated his superiority, his control over the situation clear. He threatened to abandon his restraint altogether, hinting that his patience was wearing thin, and that he was more than capable of ending the conflict with brute force if pushed any further. As Yo Dongbin and Eunho sat together, the tension between them had eased, though Yo Dongbin's tone remained firm. He brought up an urgent matter, one that concerned rectifying the mistakes Eunho had committed in the past. There was no anger in his voice now, only the weight of responsibility, as he laid out the task ahead. Eunho, ever deflective, responded with a hint of sarcasm. He acknowledged that he needed to reflect on his past wrongdoings and make amends, seeing it as another means of accumulating virtue. His words were light, but the undercurrent of seriousness in the situation was clear. With a swift flick of his finger, Yeodongbin produced a book, sending it toward Eunho. The book, now resting in Eunho's hands, piqued his curiosity. He glanced at it, a trace of confusion crossing his features, as he wondered aloud if it was something for him to read. Yeodongbin explained that the book was no ordinary text. It was a nearly lost relic, one that had been buried by his sister, unaware of its significance. It had belonged to her late brother and contained the essence of taeguk, a profound martial art written by none other than Jang Sambong, a legendary figure in martial history. Eunho, unfamiliar with the name, expressed his confusion. Jang Sambong? Who was this person? He wondered aloud. Yeodongbin, with a stern look, reminded him of the severity of their past encounter. Jang Sambong was the one who had come close to ending Eunho's life, nearly breaking his neck in a battle that had almost sent him to the afterlife. There was no room for misunderstanding the gravity of this mission now. In a final, resolute tone, Yeodongbin charged Eunho with a task of great importance. The book was not meant for him to keep. It needed to be returned to its rightful place, and Yeodongbin made sure Eunho understood that this was not a request, but a responsibility, one that could not be ignored. Eunho stood in front of the weathered statue, his eyes fixed on the familiar face carved in stone. It was the likeness of an old friend from his past life, a reminder of bonds long buried by time. The figure's expression was solemn, frozen in place, yet it stirred something deep within Eunho, a sense of purpose he had long avoided. The weight of his task hung in the air around him, as the memories of that past life came flooding back.